right, ready to dive into a topic that's notoriously complicated, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're going to be using excerpts from Wikipedia's Israeli-Palestinian conflict page, hoping to kind of shed some light on how things got to where they are today.
It's definitely one of those topics where you can't just look at the headlines. You have to go way back.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. That's when the whole idea of Zionism, of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, really started gaining traction. And with that came more and more Zionist settlers, right? So you start to see tensions rising with the Arab population that was already lying there. So from your perspective, why is understanding this period so important for grasping the conflict as it is today?
Well, I think it lays the groundwork for one of the most enduring themes of this whole conflict: land and displacement. Imagine for a second you're a Palestinian living in Palestine at that time. You're seeing all these changes happening around you, this influx of people coming in with the aim of creating their own state. I mean, that would create some serious anxiety, wouldn't it? A very real fear of being pushed out of your own home.
Yeah, you can only imagine. And it's not like that fear was unfounded, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we see it explode in 1920 with the Jerusalem riots. Then again, just a few years later, you have the Hebron and Safe massacres in 1929. These weren't just isolated incidents.
Oh, absolutely not. These were some of the early warning signs, tragic events that really foreshadowed the escalating violence that would come to define the conflict in many ways. You can almost trace a direct line from the mistrust and grievances of that era to what we're seeing even today.
It's a lot to process, honestly. And then you have this pivotal moment in 1947, the UN partition plan. The idea was to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. It seems pretty straightforward on paper, right? What went wrong?
Well, I think it's easy to underestimate just how complex the situation on the ground already was. The plan was immediately rejected by Palestinian Arabs and a number of Arab states, and even some Zionist groups weren't exactly thrilled with it.
Yeah, it's clear that the plan didn't really account for all the nuances and different perspectives.
Yeah.
And that rejection had major consequences, leading directly to the 1948 war. And even that war wasn't just a clear-cut two-sided thing. You had all these different armed groups involved, each with their own goals and strategies. It sounds chaotic.
Well, it was. For Palestinians, 1948 was a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands were forced from their homes, creating a refugee crisis that still hasn't been resolved. And the impact of that displacement, you can't overstate it.
No, absolutely not. I mean, even today, the right of return for Palestinians to those lands they lost is a huge point of contention. Israel completely rejects it, and it feels like, I don't know, an impossible gap to bridge.
It's one of those issues that's been at the heart of every peace negotiation since, and it just never seems to go away. It's almost like a ghost that haunts the entire conflict. And this leads us to 1967, the Six-Day War. That war completely changed the game. Israel wins, and they end up occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These are territories with a large Palestinian population.
And that, of course, is the start of the Israeli occupation. It's considered the longest military occupation in modern history, which is, I mean, that's pretty wild to think about. What's it been like for Palestinians living in these territories?
Well, life under occupation, it's complicated. Israel starts building settlements in these territories, something that's considered illegal under international law. And then there's the whole system of checkpoints, restrictions on movement. You have separate legal systems for Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. It creates this very real, very stark inequality.
Yeah, and that's drawn a lot of criticism, right? International human rights organizations, even the United Nations, have accused Israel of basically implementing a system of apartheid, which are some serious allegations.
Absolutely, they are. And these accusations stem from, observing discriminatory policies and practices that limit Palestinians' basic rights and freedoms. Now, of course, Israel denies these accusations, but the point is there's a huge debate about what the occupation really means, and it's far from settled.
Right. And we can't really talk about the occupation without mentioning the Palestinian uprisings, the intifadas. First one starts in 1987, lasts until 1993. A lot of civil disobedience, protests. Then the second intifada, which was triggered by the failure of peace talks, was a lot more violent.
Yeah, the intifadas really highlight the desperation and frustration of Palestinians living under occupation. They changed the political landscape in a major way and unfortunately hardened positions on both sides, which made meaningful dialogue, even tougher to achieve.
Tougher was putting it lightly, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, the violence doesn't end there. In 2006, Hamas takes control of the Gaza Strip. And then you have a series of devastating wars between Hamas and Israel beginning in 2008, escalating dramatically in 2023.
Yeah, and that 2023 war, it was brutal. Thousands of civilians were killed on both sides. It really raised questions about war crimes and the potential for genocide, which, just deepened the animosity and mistrust.
It's hard to see any path to peace when you have that level of violence.
Sure.
But there have been efforts, right? Attempts to try and find some kind of resolution.
Yes, there have been a lot of peace initiatives over the years, each one with its own set of challenges. And honestly, understanding those attempts, why they failed, is crucial to understanding why we are where we are today. It's like every time there's a glimmer of hope, it gets snuffed out almost immediately.
Right. Like one step forward, two steps back kind of thing.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So I think figuring out why all these attempts at peace have failed, why they keep hitting a wall, is really important.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these attempts. Where do we even begin? What are some of the key ones that stand out, and why didn't they work out?
All right, so let's go back to 1981. The Saudi Arabian peace plan. This one was endorsed by the entire Arab League, which is pretty significant in itself. And basically, it called for a two-state solution. So Israel would withdraw from the occupied territories in exchange for peace and recognition from Arab states. I mean, that was a pretty bold move, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't end up going anywhere, but it definitely introduced a framework that we see coming up again and again in future peace efforts. That whole land for peace, two-state solution concept, it really set the stage for what came after.
Exactly. And then in 1988, you have the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, and they issue their Declaration of Independence. And this declaration, it accepts the two-state solution, which is huge because before this, the PLO was calling for Israel to be dismantled completely. So this was a major shift in their position.
Okay, so that's a big turning point for sure. And it opens the door for direct negotiations with Israel, right?
Yeah.
Because Arafat renounces terrorism and accepts those UN resolutions that recognize Israel's right to exist, which then paves the way for the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. Those were meant to establish this framework for peace, right?
Right. Oslo was groundbreaking. It led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which meant Palestinians would have some level of self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. But, and this is a big but, the Accords didn't really address some of the thorniest issues.
Right, like the status of Jerusalem, the Palestinian refugees, the Israeli settlements, all that was left for future negotiations. Looking back, that might have been a fatal flaw.
Maybe. I mean, it's easy to say that now. But at the time, there was this hope that if they tried to tackle those issues right off the bat, it would just derail the whole process. They wanted to build up some trust first, and then deal with the harder stuff. Didn't really work out that way, though.
No, it definitely didn't. Okay, so then we get to Camp David in 2000. President Clinton brings Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat together to try and hammer out a final agreement. There was so much hope riding on that. What happened?
Well, it failed, and everyone started pointing fingers. Each side blamed the other for the collapse of the talks. But it did make it clear just how entrenched both sides were on things like Jerusalem and the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
Like, compromise was just completely off the table. And after that, you have the Roadmap for Peace in 2002, which was backed by the Quartet. So the U.S., the UN, the EU, and Russia. It was another attempt at this sort of phased process. Confidence-building measures first, and then eventually a final agreement. Did that have any more success?
Nope, sadly not. The roadmap ran into the same problems as all the other attempts before it. The deep mistrust, the ongoing violence, both sides were just so suspicious of each other. Every little thing, every broken promise, every act of violence just pushed them further apart.
It's like every time they tried to bandage the wound, something would rip it right back open.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So then you have the Arab Peace Initiative, first proposed in 2002, and it's been reaffirmed a bunch of times since then. This one was interesting because it offered Israel full normalization of relations with all the Arab states in exchange for a complete withdrawal from the occupied territories and a just solution for the Palestinian refugees.
Right. That was a big deal because it showed that the Arab world was willing to make peace. But the Israeli government, they've always rejected it. They're just not okay with some of the conditions, like going back to the pre-1967 borders.
So basically, every single attempt at peace just hits this wall. It makes you wonder what the real sticking points are,
Yeah.
What are those fundamental issues that just keep derailing these efforts?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And there are a few core issues that keep coming up that just never seem to get resolved. Each one of them is super complex, super emotionally charged.
Okay, so let's try to break them down a little bit. What are we talking about here? What are those issues that are really at the heart of this conflict?
Well, I think the most obvious one, the one that everyone knows about, is the status of Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim it as their capital, and it's religiously significant for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So you can see how that adds another whole layer of complexity.
Oh, yeah. You've got all these overlapping historical claims, deeply held religious beliefs, and just decades of political baggage, all centered on this one city. How do you even begin to untangle all of that?
You don't. Not easily, anyway. And within Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, which Muslims call Haram al-Sharif, that's probably the most sensitive spot. Some of the holiest sites in Judaism and Islam are right there. Even the slightest hint of a provocation can lead to massive unrest.
So trying to divide Jerusalem, or even just figure out who controls what within the old city, is a non-starter. It would be a disaster.
Pretty much. And then you have the issue of the Palestinian refugees. Remember all those people who were displaced in 1948? Hundreds of thousands. Their descendants now number in the millions. And a lot of them are demanding the right to return to the homes their families lost, what's now Israel.
Right. And that's a really tough one. Israel sees the return of all those refugees as a threat. An existential threat, really. They think it would change the entire character of the country. It could even mean they'd no longer have a Jewish majority.
And for Palestinians, it's about justice, about historical redress. It's a fundamental human right. It's more than just the land. It's about their identity, where they belong.
So you have these two totally opposing viewpoints. Each side sees it as something essential to who they are. It's hard to imagine either side being willing to compromise on this.
Exactly. And then you have Israel's security concerns. Israel has been attacked by Palestinian militant groups for decades. They say they need to keep some level of control in the West Bank and Gaza to protect their citizens.
Which means checkpoints, the separation barrier, targeted killings, all these security measures the Palestinians see as oppressive and completely unfair. And that just creates more violence, more mistrust. It's a vicious cycle.
It really is, and it's incredibly hard to break free from. Okay, so we've talked about Jerusalem, refugees, security. Those are the big ones. But there are other things we need to think about too, like water.
Oh, right, water resources. The West Bank and Israel share underground aquifers. And who controls those aquifers has been another source of tension, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Israel controls most of those water resources, which means that Palestinians, especially those living in the West Bank, often don't have enough water. They have all these restrictions on how much water they can use, and it's a basic human need.
It's crazy how unequal the distribution is.
It is, and in Gaza, it's even worse. The water shortage is there, and the sanitation problems. It's a humanitarian crisis on top of everything else they have to deal with. It's a total mess.
Okay, so we've got Jerusalem, refugees, security, water. It's a lot to keep track of. Is there anything else we should be considering?
Well, we should probably talk about agricultural rights as well. A big part of the Palestinian economy is agriculture. But the thing is, a lot of Israeli policies have made it really hard for Palestinian farmers to access their land and water.
So you're talking about land confiscations,
Yeah.
restrictions on movement, uprooting olive trees, making it hard for them to get their products to market.
Exactly. And it's not just an economic issue. This is about Palestinians being able to feed themselves, to maintain their connection to the land.
Right. And all of this just adds to the sense of injustice and frustration.
Right. Palestinians feel trapped, like they have no control over their own lives. And when you have all that pressure building up for decades, it's no surprise that violence keeps erupting.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And with the rise of right-wing extremism on both sides, is there even any hope for a peaceful future?
That's the question, isn't it? Things might seem pretty bleak right now, but ultimately, I believe peace is a choice. It's a difficult choice, but it is a choice.
But how do you get people to choose peace when they've grown up surrounded by so much animosity and fear?
Yeah.
How do you break through that?
It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some really incredible leaders, people who are willing to challenge those narratives of fear and division. And it's going to take genuine effort from both sides to try to understand where the other is coming from. Building bridges, fostering dialogue, recognizing our shared humanity. It's a long road.
It sounds almost impossible. But is there another option? Can we really just give up on the possibility of peace?
I don't think so. The alternative, having another generation grow up in this endless cycle of violence and hatred, is just too awful to think about.
Wow. So we've talked about a lot, the history, the occupation, all the failed attempts at peace, those core issues that seem almost impossible to resolve. It's a lot to absorb, you know. What would you say, like, if you had to pick one thing, what's the single biggest obstacle to peace in this conflict?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It's like you're asking me to choose the strongest link in a chain that's been, forged over generations of conflict. But if I had to pick just one, I think it's the lack of trust, the sheer lack of trust. Decades of violence, broken promises, political maneuvering, it's created this huge chasm of suspicion between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they move forward when there's just no foundation of trust to build on. They're kind of stuck reacting to each other's fear. And that makes it really hard to find any sort of common ground, doesn't it?
It does, and that lack of trust, it just poisons everything. It makes it almost impossible to even talk about those core issues. Jerusalem, refugees, security, they both see each other as an existential threat, so neither side wants to make any concessions, anything that could have put their own survival at risk. And it just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of fear.
Right, so it's like a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Any gain for one side is automatically seen as a loss for the other.
Exactly. And unfortunately, you have political leaders who exploit those fears. I mean, it's a lot easier to rally support when you're pointing fingers and blaming the other side than it is to actually have difficult conversations and try to find some kind of compromise.
It's that classic us versus them tactic, right? And it's been used to justify conflict forever.
Yeah, and the longer this conflict goes on, the more deeply rooted those narratives become. It makes it harder to imagine a future where Israelis and Palestinians can actually live together peacefully, where security and dignity aren't these mutually exclusive things.
So it's a pretty bleak outlook. Is there anything at all that gives you hope? Are there any signs that things could change?
I think it's important to remember that even though things look really bad, especially when you focus on the news and all the political stuff, there are a lot of people working really hard for peace. Individuals, organizations, they're trying to build bridges, have conversations, challenge those narratives of hate.
It's like a grassroots movement, right? Just regular people trying to make a difference.
Exactly. Things like people-to-people initiatives, interfaith dialogues, joint projects focused on things like education and healthcare and economic development. Those are the seeds of a different kind of future.
It shows that it's possible for people to connect with each other, even in a conflict like this.
It does. And at the end of the day, that's what it's going to take. A real change in how people think about this conflict, recognizing that we're all human and being willing to work towards a future where everyone can feel safe and have dignity.
It's a hard road, no doubt,
Yeah.
but it's worth fighting for.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope everyone listening will keep learning about this conflict, keep asking questions, don't let the headlines and the political stuff drown out those voices that are working for peace.
Because the future of this conflict, it really depends on us, on our willingness to understand each other, to have empathy, and to keep working towards a just and lasting peace.